Okay. I want to welcome you to this presentation about our trip to Israel. Just a little bit of a background to that. Last Christmas, on our way to our family reunion for Christmas, Ramona and I were talking. If we're ever going to go to Israel, it needs to be this summer, because we figured we were getting too old to go later. And going to Israel had been on our bucket list for 30, 40 years, I don't know, forever. And so we get to the family gathering, and we're exchanging gifts on Christmas morning. And the family, that's my granddaughters, my daughter, my son-in-law, and my son, give us a trip to Israel. And so we said, wow, this is fantastic. We got our trip to Israel. So we left May 31st, came back to Dothan on June the 9th. And we had another thing on our bucket list, and that was to kind of go more like first class or business class, which we had never done. And so we did that, and that was a lifetime thing. One of the nice things about it was the food. The food was actually filet mignon and all kinds of other stuff, but it was quite nice. We had two full-fledged meals on each flight there and back. This was El Al, which is the Israeli Airlines. Well, when we get there, we join with the rest of the group. The whole group, except for one or two, traveled. We were all on the same airplane, and there was about 50 of us. It was led by a friend of ours by the name of Rob Morgan that we've known for since 1978 or somewhere along in there. And he's led 40 of these trips or more. And so we were able to go on this trip with him as our tour guide, and that was a blessing. Well, just before I get too far into this, just a little bit about the political situation in Israel. All of the light yellow kind of what you see is territory exclusively controlled by Israel. The green part that you kind of see there in the middle of Israel is kind of what are called disputed territories in a sense. Technically, they're all under Israel, but they're divided into three areas. One area, about 60% of that green area, is totally and exclusively under Israeli control. About 20% is a mixture of Israeli and Palestinian Authority control, and the other 20% is exclusively Palestinian Authority control. That little area is divided up into something like 165 little areas. Every area is kind of under somebody else's control. And so this is a terribly confusing area. And we had to go back and forth in that area. And that makes a difference on how some of the tour groups do their tours. But Israel itself is looks like this, where I'm going to be starting from. Everything that we went to was in this area of Israel. First place we went to was we headed north along the coast and went to Caesarea. One of the big things in Caesarea is this arena, or where they had whatever they had back then, speeches and theater and so forth. And in this theater, probably Paul may have even spoke. I don't know. It doesn't refer to that exactly. But this theater has been there for since the days of Paul. But one of the things interesting about that is this is also where Herod's palace was. And so when you walk out of that arena and head a little bit north along the coast, you come to what was Herod's palace. These had a number of arches leading into Herod's palace. But Herod's palace itself was this huge thing. It had an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And this is also where Pilate lived. But for Paul, this is where he was held as a captive for 2 years. You remember he was arrested in Jerusalem at the end of his third missionary journey, and he was held here for 2 years. We don't know where he stayed there. Now, there's a place or two where people say this is where he stayed, but we don't know for sure. But there were a couple of rooms. Ramona is standing in one. That might have been where he was. There was another next to it that was smaller. But we know he was there somewhere in this conglomeration. And this would have been a pretty nice place to stay, because right next to it was a hippodrome, which is where they did horse racing and so forth. So Paul might have been able to look outside his prison window and watch the horse races. But one of the things that probably happened there for 2 years, sometimes we might wonder, why in the world was he there for 2 years? It might have been that this is when Paul wrote, or when Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, because this would have been an excellent place to do that. Peter would have maybe been in the area. We know that Philip, the deacon, was in the area. And so he would have had for 2 years, he would have had all kinds of people that he could have interviewed to write the Gospel of Luke. So it could have been in God's providence that he left him here for those years with Luke. Now, right beside it is a stone monument that has the name of Pilate on it. For years, people said Pilate didn't really exist, that he was made up. The Gospels made him up. But then right there at Caesarea, they found this that confirms that Pilate really was the governor when the Bible says he was. Caesarea is also famous for its aqueducts. They have 4 of them. This was maybe the most important one that brought fresh water to his palace, to Herod's palace. I climbed up on top just to see what it looked like. I was the only idiot that did that. But up there on the top, there was just this little narrow trough is where actually the water went. And but that was a phenomenal feat. From here, all of my little arrows. This is bad. I had little arrows on all these. I don't know where they all went. But we went from there north. I don't know if you can see a little thing sticking out. That was Mount Carmel. Well, on the way there, we passed all kinds of little villages. Little villages like this are scattered by the hundreds all over Israel. And this one happened to be mostly a Muslim one. You could tell because of the 2 spires of their mosque. But, there's one. Okay, so we arrived at Mount Carmel, which was up here. And you remember Mount Carmel was where Elijah had his confrontation with the prophets of Baal, and God sent down fire. But there was lots of things that had to do with Carmel in the Old Testament. And the phenomenal thing about it, you could stand up on top of Mount Carmel where we were here. You could see almost all the way across Israel. It was just amazing. This is overlooking what's called the Valley of Jezreel. But you can also look a little bit farther south and see the Valley of Megiddo. And you can just see, you can see Mount Tabor, Mount Gilboa. I mean, there's just lots and lots of stuff that you could see from up on top of this mountain. From there, we headed more inland, and we passed a lot of these. What these are banana groves that they cover, and they cover them to keep the moisture in. But they have just got hundreds of acres of banana groves that look like that. Well, from there, we headed toward the Sea of Galilee, and one of the first places we went to was a mountain that was where they believed that the Sermon on the Mount was given. And of course, every place that Jesus supposedly did something, there's a church. Now, I could have taken pictures of hundreds of churches. I've only got maybe 1 or 2. I didn't go there to take pictures of churches. But this would have been what they consider, everybody's pretty well considers to be the Mount of the Beatitudes, where he gave the Sermon on the Mount. A beautiful vista where you can overlook Down, just right down there on the kind of on the edge of it is this big flat area where the acoustics are absolutely amazing, that he may have been where he gave this sermon. Right now there's a banana grove there, but as you can see, all covered up. Lots of beautiful foliage up there, absolutely magnificent place. From there, we headed north toward Mount Hebron. Mount Hebron was the northernmost part of Israel. Mount Hebron is shared by Israel, by Jordan, and by Syria. So it's kind of the corner pockets place up there. It's the highest mountain in Israel. It's covered with snow in the wintertime, and mostly the Sea of Galilee is fed by the snows that melt off of that and then run down to the Sea of Galilee and then on down to the Dead Sea. So on our way up there, we went through one of their parks that had a magnificent archaeological dig that we didn't have time to go visit, unfortunately, but you can see one of the streams that went through the park that fed into the Sea of Galilee to make it what it is. But while we were going up there, we were going to Caesarea Philippi. Now, you remember in the Bible, Caesarea Philippi was where the place where Jesus was with his disciples after 2.5 or 3 years of ministry, and he says, "Who do men say that I am?" And you remember Peter said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And so then Jesus said to him, "On this rock I will build my church." And then he makes a very strange statement. He says, "And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So that was when up at Caesarea. Caesarea was a super duper Roman pagan area. I mean, these are some of the ruins that date back to the days of Jesus. There was a huge Roman conglomeration of people up there. And the reason they were there was for this cave. This cave is in the side of the mountain. And in Jesus' day, the waters from Mount Hebron Mount Harmon would come down through the rocks and come out of this cave. This is a massive cave. Now, since then, there has been some earthquakes and so forth, so now the water comes out below it. But this cave goes all the way back to, well, we know it goes back before the Israelites came into Canaan from Egypt. The pagans believed, and especially the Baal worshippers and the Asherah worshippers, that this cave was the opening between heaven and the earth and the place of the demonic world. And they believed that in every fall, the fertility spirits would go into this cave and winter there, and then in the spring they would come out, and then everything would start to grow. This was probably the most, if there was one super duper pagan place in all of Israel, this would have been it. Somebody called it the red light district of Israel, spiritually speaking, because it was so notorious for that. Now, right there in front of this cave, you can kind of see it, some ruins that were part of a temple built to Augustus. So there was a temple there, but there were other temples too. Beside it, in the rocks, this is a drawing, and I'll show you a picture of these in a minute, was a grotto to the god Pan, and Pan was actually the oldest one that was celebrated here. The next one is Zeus, and the next one is Nemesis. And then you see like a little courtyard down there, a round thing. This was the court of the goats. And what the pagans did would go, I don't know if I ought to say this or not, but anyway, they would go and have some really bad relations with goats there as part of their pagan worship. And so this was an incredibly pagan area all the way back 1,500 years before Jesus took his disciples there. This was the grotto to Pan that Ramona is standing next to. The next one was for Zeus, and then the next one was for Nemesis. So you can look there and you can see all of these ruins that are still there. So this is a very pagan area. So whenever Jesus took his disciples here and was speaking there, notice, I want you to get a feel for what he was doing. He took his disciples right into right into the jaws of hell. And he looks there and he says, I'm going to build my church. And I can imagine him pointing to that and saying, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Because that opening was also called the gates of hell. And so it was like he took his disciples to the most powerful demonic place in Israel to proclaim that he was going to build his church. And when he says the gates of hell will not prevail against it, what was he saying? He was basically saying, we are going to storm this and we are going to defeat it. I mean, it was just an incredible pronunciation on the part of Jesus. Well, from there we went over to the Golan Heights. Nothing much to see over there. You get a couple good views of Jordan Valley and everything. And then from there we went back around the Sea of Galilee to Magdala. Magdala was a city, of course, that existed in Jesus' day. Mary Magdala was from here. One of the things you notice is all the rocks are black, and that's because all the rocks in Galilee are basically black rocks, which the Romans hated, and so they didn't use those for their architecture. They would bring in sandstone, white sandstone from other places and do their architecture. But they found Magdala there. It was found when they were getting ready to build this hotel behind there, and they dug it up. And in the course of course, if you find some archaeological things in Israel, you have to quit what you're doing and let them come and check it out. So they came and checked it out, and when they did, they found a synagogue. Now, they have unearthed something like 200 synagogues in Israel over the years. But this is the only synagogue out of the 200 that dates back to the days of Jesus. So I think it is absolutely 100% safe to say that Jesus was in this synagogue and probably taught and may have ministered here in this synagogue. From there, we went to Capernaum, which is just a few miles away, where they had another synagogue. Now, this synagogue actually dates to about 150 years or so after Jesus. If you were to dig down here, you would probably come to the synagogue that existed in Jesus' day. But nobody wants to tear this up to try to get to an older synagogue. So you just have to imagine the older synagogue is underneath all this. But right beside it is the village of Capernaum that they have dug up, and all of this does date back to the days of Jesus. And you notice they're all made out of those black stones because that's all they had to use. So Jesus very likely may have even lived in some of these places right there that are next to the synagogue, because all of this is lower in ground level than the other one. Well, we got to take a boat ride on Noah's Ark and went out in the Sea of Galilee, which is very interesting. From there, we could see Tiberias, and actually, we stayed right outside of Tiberias in a kibbutz, and we spent 4 nights there. The way this thing worked, we stayed 4 nights here, and then we stayed 5 nights in Jerusalem, so we only moved 1 time. So we stayed usually all in the same place, which made it a whole lot easier. But Tiberias this city was very prominent during Jesus' day, but you don't really read Jesus doing much here. So apparently he did not really go to this town very much because it was basically a Gentile town, is really what it was. This is the kibbutz that we stayed in. This was the oldest kibbutz in all of Israel, the very first one that they had. And this was a very nice place to stay. We were up on the 2nd floor. We had a nice little room. And the food, I'm going to say a little bit about food. The food was quite amazing. This is just a part of it. They had more food. You could go and eat a different meal every day and not eat the same thing twice. And so that was one of the perks. Now, what's interesting about their meals, they don't mix meat with dairy. And so for breakfast, when you're having dairy products like yogurt or something, you'll have dairy products, but you won't have meat. And then in the other two meals, when you have meat, you don't have any dairy products. And the reason for that is because the Bible says that you're not supposed to seethe a kid in its mother's milk, which I've always taken to mean that you're not supposed to participate in some pagan ritual, but they take it to mean don't mix meat and dairy, and so that's what they do. One of the things that you could see when we were out on the ocean, out on the sea of Galilee, was this mount called Mount Arbel, and we were almost in the shadow of this, a little bit farther north of this mountain. But if you look kind of on the right side, you'll see that there's kind of a cliff and then a valley. If you were to follow that valley up, it goes to Nazareth. So undoubtedly, Jesus walked that valley many, many, many times, going from Nazareth to the Sea of Galilee. But there's some significance, I think, to Mount Arbel. We walked up it. You can see we were there during the dry season. They have a rainy season that runs from about November to March, April. We were there the 1st of June. So by then, most of the stuff had started to die. There were a few flowers that were still left over, but they're probably gone by now. Apparently, Israel during the rainy season is absolutely beautiful. During the dry season, it's absolutely dried up. But once you got on top of Mount Arbel, there's one tree on the whole top of the mountain, and it's this tree right here, which is a carob tree. Now you can see that it has a big trunk, and then just a couple of branches that are coming out of it. A couple of years ago, this used to be a very big carob tree, but then it got a blight and started to die, and they sent all the best horticulturalists they had up there to try to save it, and they did. And this became national news because this carob tree was maybe the most famous tree in all of Israel, and so it's surviving now. But up on top of the mount, when you're up there, this carob tree, one thing about the carob tree, there was carob trees down at the base of the mountain too, and it was not carob season. There was a few green ones on there, but they gave me an old piece of a carob pod, and I tasted it. It's sweet, very interesting. After I tasted it, they said, "Don't put this in your mouth. It's probably full of worms," but it's too late by then. But it was probably these carob pods in Jesus' story of the prodigal son, when it says he fed pods to the pigs. It's probably this is what he fed them, because they're sweet and they're actually quite good. But one thing that's interesting about them, the seeds of them are those little seeds that you see next to them. All of the seeds of the carob pod are exactly the same size. And because they're the same size, they were used to measure gold. So they would measure gold by the number of carob seeds that it was equaling. And it is from that we get the word carat. So when you talk about 24 karat gold, you're talking about a measurement based on that little carob seed, which I thought was very interesting. Of course, I got online to verify that was true, and it is. I only put the dollar there so you get a feel for how big it is. I have it somewhere, but I'm not sure where. But on top of the mountain, you can kind of look. This is looking north, and you see a little Muslim village down there. Then you kind of looking from north, looking toward the east, you come to another village, and then finally you get to a point where you can see this area of the Sea of Galilee. And what's interesting, almost all of Jesus' ministry was in that area that you can see right there. It is almost incredible how small an area Jesus' ministry was in. Because you can see, well, if you knew where they were, you could see Magdala, you could see Capernaum, you could see Chorazin, you could see Bethsaida. All of these villages are all right there on this edge of the Sea of Galilee. Now, the Sea of Galilee is not that big. In fact, Lake Eufaula is 10% bigger than the Sea of Galilee. And so it's smaller than what you might think. And so that's where Jesus' ministry was. Now, up on top of Mount Arbel is this big flat area. And I believe, here's what I think. I believe that this is where Jesus gave the Great Commission in Matthew 28. You remember when the angels were talking to the women at the tomb, they said to the angels said to the women, tell the disciples that I will meet them in Galilee. Now, when you get to Matthew chapter 28 and start reading the Great Commission, there's something there I had never noticed before. It says they went to the mountain that he told them to go to. And then he gave the Great Commission. Well, now, what was the mountain that he told them to go? This was the only appointment that Jesus made with his disciples, was on this mountain. And I think it was this mountain because it was so big, it was so flat, the acoustics are great. But what's interesting, up there, you can see almost as it were the whole world. So when he says go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, it's like he could stand up there and say, okay, you go, what you're looking at there is Samaria, beyond that is Judea. You could look around north where I was, you're looking up into Syria, you look at the other direction, you're looking over to Jordan. I mean, you could just see huge areas up there. And so I'm inclined to think that this is the mountain that he told his disciples to go to and then gave the Great Commission. Oops. All right, from there we went to Nazareth, and inland a little bit. This was standing at one of the restaurants where we were eating. Now, let me see, I can't remember if I put now. Okay, Nazareth, I skipped something. Nazareth was in the Palestinian Authority area. It is a big, dirty city. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about it. And so we went there, saw a few things, but didn't see a whole lot in Nazareth. Now, this was a couple of shots of things that we saw in Nazareth, because Nazareth is a Muslim town, city. But one of the things it is known for, it does have a synagogue. And behind, you see where those people are going into that little door at the end of the picture, that goes into this synagogue. And this synagogue undoubtedly was much nicer than the one that Jesus was in, because in Jesus' day, Nazareth was not a very big city. And so, but they have this synagogue there that's very interesting, the kind that they would have worshiped in. From there, we went to Megiddo. And Megiddo, of course, is well known in biblical days. It's up, of course, Megiddo was built up on a kind of a plateau. The steps that you see there, they have unearthed them. Those steps probably date all the way back to the days of Solomon, because Solomon is the one that really built Megiddo, because this is where he kept his horses and so on and so forth. So it has a very elaborate system of gates. To get into the city of Megiddo, you had to go through 4 different gates just to get inside of it. So it was well protected. Just a big, massive area up on top of there. Kind of hard to make sense out of what's there, but they have excavated so much of it that you get a sense of the grandeur and the size of Megiddo. This was a stable where there were horses, so there were feed troughs here. They could figure out that this is where Solomon's horses lived in his day. It was also well known for their springs. You had to go down almost 9 stories, the equivalent of 9-story building, to go down inside the middle of this. And down at the bottom was a pool of water, probably about 12 feet across. And that supplied the water for Megiddo, so that if they were under siege, they would never run out of water. They always were sure that that would be good. There were only a few of us that went down there. This is a view from up on Megiddo. You can look out over this plain. There were bunches of battles that were fought there. The mountain that you see on the back there is Mount Tabor. This is just all kinds of history that took place in this valley. This is actually the valley, part of the Valley of Jezreel, but it's called the Valley of Megiddo. You've heard of the Battle of Armageddon. That would be where that battle would be fought. Well, from there, we then went to Shiloh. And Shiloh, well, let me back up here just a minute. On one side of the mountain of Shiloh, there is nothing but just all kinds of houses. You could tell the whole side of the mountain was a village. And so we went over the mountain of Shiloh, the hill. It's a big, big, big hill. And on the other side, we found some people who were doing a dig. And they were digging up stuff, and here's somebody that's shuffling through the stuff that they dig up to see what they can find. And we met this guy right there, the guy in the light blue shirt. His name is Dr. Scott Stripling. And what he has been excavating this site since 2017. Now, the guy next to him was our tour guide. But he's been excavating this since 2017. And he is convinced that what he has found here is the site of the Ark of the Tabernacle. Now, you remember when the children of Israel went into Palestine and conquered it, they set up the tabernacle at Shiloh. And the temple and the tabernacle stayed at Shiloh for 369 years. Until you remember that time when they went to fight against the Philistines, and they had the brilliant idea, let's go get the Ark of the Covenant, take the Ark of the Covenant out to battle with us. Well, the Ark of the Covenant got captured by the Philistines. Apparently, at the same time, the Philistines burned Shiloh and destroyed the tabernacle. So after that, then, you have the various parts of the tabernacle in different places. For example, by David's day, the table of showbread was at Nob. And so the different, the candelabra was someplace else, and table of showbread, or the altar of incense was somewhere else. And then, of course, the altar went someplace. The Ark of the Covenant did not go back here. It ended up in the house of Abimelech. But this, what he is convinced is that he has found the site of where the tabernacle was sitting. And what surprised him was the fact that it was a stone architecture. But he gave us about a 15-minute speech on why he believes that this is the ark that this is the tabernacle. Because he said, at some point, this tabernacle made out of skins is going to deteriorate and rot, especially in that kind of climate. He said, so it makes sense that they would have built something that was more permanent. And so this area that you see him right there is where he thinks the holy place was, because the dimensions are exactly perfect for the holy place, the Holy of Holies. Across from it, on the other side of the right, kind of going down this path, the Holy of Holies is on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you have what he has identified as the holy place, because its dimensions are exactly the size of the holy place. And so probably all of this architecture and all these houses that you find on the other side of the mountain would have been where the priests live, and so on and so forth. And then this area would have been big enough to have held the whole court of, the court of the Gentiles, the court of men, the court of women, and so forth. And also another interesting thing they found is down below it was this large, massive collection of animal bones, all of them from clean animals. And what's also interesting is that most of them, they only have the right side of the animal. Now, if you remember, the right side of the animal belonged to the priest. And so the other part of the animal would have been carried off by whoever made the sacrifice, and this part would have remained with the priest. So anyway, he gave a really, what I thought was a great argument for why he believes that this is where the tabernacle was. Now, if he's right, then this may have been the greatest archaeological find of our day. If you actually, somebody finds the place where the tabernacle was. Now, down below that, at the base of Shiloh, is a church that you see on the left. In the meantime, it's been destroyed. But what's interesting there is that rock, there is a rock that you see on the right-hand side that is one of the 4 rocks that made up the altar. This and that little bump you see there is what's called the horns of the altar. And up there at the site that he's digging up right now, he's found the other 3 that go with this one. And so somewhere along the line, somebody found this up there and brought it down and incorporated it into this church. But he's found now with that one all 4 of the big rocks that would have made the altar. And so you have these 4 horns of the altar. That was another interesting thing too. These are the people that were working on it. It was a big crew. This is where they took their lunch break to the ones working on it. Well, from there, we left and went to, where did we go? Oh, we went to Mount Garrison. So we're on top of Mount Garrison here. There's all kinds of ruins and everything on Mount Garrison. All of these ruins that you see here date after Jesus, so none of that stuff was there when Jesus was there. The mountain, of course, was there. If you look on the other side where you see those towers, that is Mount Ebal. We're looking north here because Mount Garrison was on the south. You remember back in the day that people would get together and every 3 years and they'd read the law. The blessings were read from Mount Garrison. The curses were read from Mount Ebal. Well, down in between these two mountains, well, incidentally, you can't go on top of Mount Ebal because it's a military installation now. But down in between them, you can kind of see a town, and that's Sychar, or that's where Jacob's well was. But taking a moment and looking back even farther south, you see that little town down there. That is also on top of Mount Garrison, and this town is one of the primary locations for a group of people that still exist, the Samaritans. There are 400 Samaritans that live in this town. There are 400 more that live in a suburb near Tel Aviv, so there are only 800 Samaritans left in the world, and they live in these 2 places. But what they do is they come back to Mount Garrison once a year, all 800 of them, to this spot to celebrate Passover, because they still celebrate Passover. Now, the Jews don't celebrate Passover with sacrifices because the temple's gone. But the Samaritans never did sacrifice in Jerusalem. This is where they made their sacrifices. So they come back here at Passover to do that. Well, this guy right here was a priest who does this kind of thing. And he said he can trace his lineage all the way back to Aaron. And so he's got this little shop there that's right next door to that building that you saw. I don't know if you had any of the cookies in there. There was a little tea biscuit cookie. I bought that from him in that little shop just to express appreciation for talking to us about what they do. And so up there they've got, these are their altars where they get together and sacrifice their lambs at Passover. Afterwards they hang them on these meat hooks all around this area. And then this, I got online to find a picture. This is them celebrating Passover at that spot that we just saw. They're hanging their meat on these hooks. These are the altars where they, I guess probably the priests are cooking their portion of it. But the other part, you see the rest of them, they're putting their lambs on these big long sticks, which are like big long massive skewers. And the reason they do that is because right beside that, they have these fire pits. And so they take the lids off, they build a fire inside of each one of these, and then they take their skewers and they stick them all down inside there, and that's how they all prepare their lambs. And then about midnight, they take them out and they distribute them. They go onto all the little houses, and they eat the Passover together. So I just thought that was all very fascinating. Once you go down from Mount Garrison, you go down into Sychar, and that's where they have Jacob's well. And this supposedly is the spot where Jesus talked to the woman, the Samaritan woman by the well. It could be because this thing is quite a bit below the ground level, and it's about 30 or 40 feet deep or something like that. But you can go down there and get some water and drink it. Whoops. Well, from there, we went back over toward the south end of the Sea of Galilee to the entrance, or to the mouth of the Jordan River, and this is where we went for the baptisms of people that wanted to be baptized. Surprisingly, the Jordan River is not very big, and this is right up at the mouth, so this is about as big as it was. But of course, you remember we're about 2 or 3 months into the dry season, so it hadn't rained, and so it's a little bit lower than normal. But the reason we went to that area is because that area was all part of Israel. There's only about 5 miles or so where Israel has both sides of the Jordan River, and this was one of them. So this is where people would go to get baptized, and you have to pay like $10 or $12 to rent one of those little white robes, and you have to be wearing a white robe if you want to get baptized there. So it's a kind of a money-making thing. I didn't get baptized because they wouldn't sprinkle me. But anyway, we had about 16 or 17 of us that were baptized there in that river. Now, this is not where Jesus was baptized. Jesus was baptized much farther south, probably close to where Jericho was. But the problem is that area down there is under the control of the Palestinian Authority. And so it's much more complicated to get in there and do baptism. So they would do it here because all of this was under Jewish control. From there, we went a little bit farther south to Beth Sheen. And what is that Beth Sheen? It was in Jesus' day, it was one of the 10 cities, the Decapolis. The big mountain that you see behind it was in David's day and in Saul's day was called Beth Sheen. You remember when Saul and his sons were killed in battle against the Philistines, that their bodies were taken and attached to a wall? That's where that happened, back there on that big mound. There was a city up there. Well, in Jesus' day, that was somewhat abandoned. But what was down in the below it was one of the Gentile Decapolis cities, and it was a massive thing. They have discovered bathhouses, several very elaborate bathhouses there with elaborate heating systems, all kinds of fancy tile and so forth, a big, beautiful roadway, fancy architecture. Oops. Did I get skipped? Yeah, I skipped. Okay. They also have there this big amphitheater. One of our ladies stood there and sang God Bless America, I think it was. And it just carried everywhere, of course, with no microphones or anything. But here's what's interesting. Whenever it talked about the prodigal son going into a far country, this may have been what Jesus had in mind when he said that, because this was a thoroughly pagan city. And Jesus undoubtedly walked through this dozens of times. Anytime he went north and south, he would have gone through this city. But apparently he had no ministry there. He doesn't say anything about it. And so it was kind of like one of those places. It was a Gentile red light district, so to speak, and apparently Jesus didn't do much more than just go through it. Now from there we went down to Jericho. Jericho is also under the authority of the Palestinian Authority. It is a dirty whatever. Okay, I mean, it's just not a very pleasant place to be. But this is where Jesus supposedly went and was tempted by the devil on these mountains right there. You would understand why he did not eat and drink for 40 days, because there's nothing to eat or drink there. So he probably did that not by choice, but just because, hey, he didn't have any choice. But it's also famous because this is the site for the city of Jericho, and they're doing all kinds of excavations there, of course. They have excavated some of the walls. The walls have fallen out. And so just an interesting archaeological place that dates where you can see where they have dug up a lot of things that confirm the Bible story of Jericho. Now from there, we headed toward Jerusalem. And here's something I didn't realize. To go from Jericho to Jerusalem, you follow along the kind of the little water riverbed, and you can see on the right hand side there's a church monastery been built down there in the base of this, but there is a little road that would go there. And so this little road is where Jesus would walk. I mean, he was surrounded by these big cliffs on both sides. And they would walk there because there was a water source there, plus there was shade there. But it also made it a very dangerous place. And so when they talk about somebody being beat up or whatever on this road, they would usually travel with groups of people in order to be safe. But I thought it was just an amazing little route that you'd have to go from Jericho up to Jerusalem. I'm throwing this in. This is apparently where David and Goliath met. They have identified that the Bible mentions 3 specific towns in conjunction with David and Goliath, and they have located all 3 of those towns. So if you can imagine, this is where that battle took place. This is apparently the hill where many of the Philistines went to when they were being defeated, but they have unearthed on the other side of this the town that the Bible talks about. It's the town of 2 gates. And anyway, it's interesting that so many things in the Bible have been confirmed. We also went to Bethlehem. This was a cave where maybe Jesus was born. I don't believe it for a minute, but anyway, it might have been born in something like that. Bethlehem, again, was in the Palestinian Authority and not much of a place. Well, there then we ended up going to Jerusalem, just a magnificent sight when you come around a hill and you look out there and you see this dome, which is actually part of a mosque, but you're looking at inside the walls of the old Jerusalem there. This was our hotel there. It was very nice. Great dining room, of course, lots of food. Again, they had more food than the other place. I just love food. But then we started our tour. We started on the Mount of Olives. Up on the Mount of Olives, you could look down on Old Jerusalem, so you see the walls of the city there. Literally thousands of graves all around this area, because this is where Jews want to be born or be buried. And one of the things that you notice on the right-hand side is the gate, the golden gates of this, and of course Christians and Muslims and Jews all believe that the Messiah is going to come through this gate whenever he comes back. Right now, the gates have been closed up. They've been closed up since the days of Saladin, which is probably, 700 years. But whenever the Messiah comes, which of course we believe is Jesus, the Messiah is supposed to open these gates and enter the city. Went down to Gethsemane. They don't really know where Gethsemane is, but this is probably maybe it. It's got some enormously old olive trees. They were not there when Jesus was here, but they may be 1,000 years old. Then from there, we walked around the southern side of the walls in order to end up getting to the wall, the Wailing Wall. But we happened to be there on a Saturday, and so there were all kinds of people that were going to the Wailing Wall. The men were on one side, there was a wall, the women were on the other side, and we were there on Pentecost weekend. So there were 3 days that they were there, that Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then the next Monday. So this was a super busy place during that whole time. They were there reading. Of course, they put prayers in all the cracks of the walls. Also, we were able to go up onto the where the Temple Mount was, but which is now a Muslim mosque, and it's the Mosque of the Dome. And it used to be that you couldn't go there, but now recently they've allowed people to go up there, so we were able to go up there. On the right, you see Ramona talking to our Israeli tour guide under one of the buildings there. Just another shot. The area is big. It's 38 acres big. It's huge. In fact, the White House compound, all of the White House compound's 36 acres. So this up here is bigger than everything at the White House. I mean, it's just huge. This is looking at the Golden Gate from inside. And so it's actually below the ground level on the inside. Now, one of the things that made it interesting, because it was, when we were up there, it happened to be Pentecost Day. And on that day, a lot of the Jews will come up on the Temple Mount, and they did that this day. Well, the Muslims, of course, were not too happy about that. And so there was a group of women that went along beside them, harassing them. And, of course, there were some Israeli soldiers up there to protect them. They also came and wanted to harass us a little bit, but again, the soldiers got in between us and them. And then we walked through the streets of Old Jerusalem, just interesting area. Came across a couple of things that reminded us of home. There are two guys that own this place that went to the University of Alabama, so that's why they have this. But we also ran into Jim and Joy Whaley. Whaley Tires. He and I were in Rotary together. We met several times. We first of all met in a gift shop. And we were in a gift shop, and I looked up. I said, Jim. He looked at me, he said, Lynn? Whoa, what are you doing here? And then we were walking down these little narrow streets in Jerusalem. We ran across each other again. So, what are the odds? They were there with a group from Mount Calvary. Or not Mount Calvary, but Calvary Baptist Church. We also went to a museum that was very interesting. The statue on the side is a statue of Asherah. The one on the other side is Baal. Remember, these are two gods that the Israelites were constantly abandoning God for. And I thought, wow, what a sorry thing. All of those gods on the bottom are Asherahs. And so these were the kinds of gods the children of Israel were going after, as opposed to going after God. A couple of the swords. The other side is, I love the weapons. I was fascinated by this coat of mail because this is probably the kind of thing that Saul wore And you remember in the story, whenever Saul was killed, he had on a coat of mail. And the Bible tells us that one of the enemy shot an arrow, and it by chance went through one of the little creases in the coat of mail. And so on the other side, you have the arrowhead. So I can just imagine one of those arrowheads, just by chance, finding a crease in this coat of mail to kill King Saul. There's also something interesting, an ossuary. An ossuary is something that holds bones. There was one here that was the bones of Jesus, son of Joseph. They found it first century. Obviously, there was another Jesus and Joseph, because I can guarantee you they did not find Jesus' bones there. But this was also interesting. This is a first century tomb. They dug up this heel that had a nail through it. This is the only actual artifact they have found of crucifixion. And if this is it, then the way they crucified them was to put their feet on either side, and the nails went into the sides, which I thought was really quite fascinating. Also there was something called the Garden of the Tomb. And this is one of there are two places where people think might have been Golgotha. But this is the one that I think probably was. It doesn't look as much like a skull as it did 150 years ago, because in the meantime, they have built up there is a bus parking lot that covers up almost half of it. So the nose and the mouth of this are now no longer visible. But the guy, Horatio Stafford, who wrote It Is Well With My Soul, who lived here in Jerusalem and wrote that hymn here in Jerusalem, looked at that mountain one day and he says, I believe that's Golgotha, because that looks exactly like a skull. And so I think that probably is where Jesus was crucified, not on top of it, but at the foot of it. Because at the foot of it, there were several roads that met. One was a road that went to Damascus, another was a road that went to Jericho. And so it makes sense that they would put the cross right down to next to the road so that everybody would see it. I always had the idea, he was crucified on top of it. No, he was probably crucified at the bottom, where everybody could see it as they went down the road. One of the things that they think might have been the tomb of Christ, which was just a stone's throw away from what we just saw there. It was divided into two chambers. Ramona is in the outer chamber. On the inner chamber was where people were actually buried. If you go back and read the story of the angels and the disciples, all of this would fit really, really well. They have a stone there which would have been something like what would have covered it. And then, of course, there was a trough that the stone would roll in to cover up the entrance. This is the last slide. But before we left, there was a group of us decided we were going to walk from the hotel. The hotel was within an easy walking distance of Jerusalem. And so on the last night of the celebration of Pentecost, a group of us decided to walk down into the Kidron Valley, because that's what Jesus did. He walked down to the Kidron Valley to go over to the Garden of Gethsemane. So we walked down there. Now, up there where the lights are, there is literally thousands and thousands of people up there celebrating the end of Pentecost. But down in the Kidron Valley, there is nobody. I mean, nobody. Our little group, we walked all down this Kidron Valley. We ran into nobody. And it was just really kind of a very sobering thing. It was just sit there quietly and think, Jesus, how many times did he walk through here? Going back and forth from Jerusalem to Gethsemane or Mount of Olives or whatever. And so anyway, that's what I'm ending with right there. All right, it is 1:15. We got to end. If you have any questions, you can ask me afterwards. You can ask Ramona. But it was a trip of a lifetime. Lord willing, I would love to go back in March of 2024 or 2024. Lord willing, I'd love to go back. Not with a tour group, though. Rent a car and drive around. But okay, well, thank you, and I'll dismiss us in prayer. Father, I do want to thank you for so much of the Holy Land that has been preserved. Father, we thank you that in many ways we can see the very same things that Jesus saw and the disciples saw. We can walk on some of the same roads that he walked on. And so, Father, I thank you for the fact that you sent your Son here to be one of us, and that, Lord, you put him in a place that was not the most glamorous place in the world, but you put him where your people were there. And so, Father, we thank you that so much of that has been preserved for us today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you.